Hello, good afternoon everyone. In this video, I'll be talking about cerebellum, its definition, anatomical division, and the cerebellar connections. The word cerebellum means little brain. The word cerebellum, it means little brain. The cerebellum, as you can see the picture, it is located posteriorly to the brainstem. Cerebellum is located posteriorly to the brainstem. It is connected to the midbrain, pons, and medulla with the help of cerebellar peduncles. The cerebellum is connected to the midbrain with the help of superior cerebellar peduncle. It is connected to the pons with the help of middle cerebellar peduncle and to the medulla with the help of inferior cerebellar peduncle. We refer to this area as a silent area of the brain because upon electrically stimulating cerebellum, there is no motor activity. There are no motor activities taking place or no conscious sensation. Cerebellum is little brain. It's a silent area of the brain because upon electrically stimulating, there are no motor activities or no conscious sensation. It is located posteriorly to the brainstem, connected to the midbrain pons and medulla with the help of cerebellar peduncles. Functional anatomy of cerebellum. There are two transverse fissures which divide the cerebellum into three lobes: an anterior lobe, a posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular lobe. The three lobes in cerebellum are anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and flocculonodular lobe. And these two fissures, there are primary and the posterior lateral fissures. There are primary fissures and posterior lateral fissures which divide this into the anterior, posterior, and flocculonodular lobe. This flocculonodular lobe, it is also called vestibulocerebellum and is concerned with balance and eye movements. The spinocerebellum, it consists of this middle portion which is called the vermis, and on either side there is a paravermal zone. The vermis along with the paravermal zone, called the spinocerebellum, is concerned with receiving the proprioceptive information from our body. To the neocerebellum, which is the lateral hemispheres. The two lateral hemispheres are called the neocerebellum, which is concerned with the planning and programming of movements. Connections of cerebellum. Cerebellar inputs, cerebellar outputs, and internal connection. Input, that's the afferents, output efferents, and internal connections. Cerebellar inputs. The cerebellum, it receives input via different fiber system, that is through climbing fibers and mossy fibers. These are two parallel fibers running into the cerebellum, and the tracts are olivocerebellar tracts. Through climbing fibers, it's olivocerebellar tract. In this olivocerebellar tract, it carries proprioceptive information from the body via the inferior olivatory nucleus. Proprioceptive information is carried from the body, the whole of the body, via the inferior olivatory nucleus. Then through mossy fibers, there are dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tract, which is involved in carrying unconscious proprioceptive and exteroceptive input. It carries unconscious proprioceptive and exteroceptive inputs. Vestibulocerebellar tract receives input from the vestibular nuclei. Tectocerebellar tract receives visual information from the superior colliculus and auditory inputs from the inferior colliculi. Cuneo-cerebellar tract is also involved in carrying the proprioceptive inputs, but this cuneo-cerebellar tract carries proprioceptive inputs from the head and neck. Cortico-pontocerebellar tract carries inputs from the cortex via pontine nuclei. Various other fiber systems are the monoaminergic inputs and thalamic and other inputs coming. The monoaminergic input, there is serotonergic and noradrenergic input. Serotonergic input comes from the raphe magnus nucleus, and noradrenergic inputs come from the locus ceruleus. Thalamic and other output from thalamus and other brain areas. These are the inputs which are coming to the cerebellum. Cerebellar outputs come from different parts of cerebellum, that is spinocerebellum, cerebrocerebellum, and vestibulocerebellum. The spinocerebellum and cerebrocerebellum will project to the descending pathways via the deep cerebellar nuclei, whereas the vestibulocerebellum does not rely in any deep cerebellar nuclei, and it will directly project to the vestibular nucleus and will control the vestibulospinal tract activity. Deep cerebellar nuclei are the nucleus fastigius, nucleus globosus, nucleus ampuliformis, and nucleus dentatus. Nucleus globosus, nucleus ampuliformis is together known as nucleus interpositus. Nucleus fastigius, it will receive the inputs from the vernal portion. the nucleus globosus and nucleus embryoniformis, which is together known as nucleus interpositus, will receive the inputs from the paravermal zone, and the nucleus dentatus receives inputs from the hemispheric portion, that is from the neocerebellum. Cerebellar outputs come from different parts of cerebellum: vestibular cerebellum, spinocerebellum, and cerebrocerebellum. From the spinocerebellum, the outputs come from the paravermal and the vermal portion. Both of them will project to different deep nuclei structures. That is spinocerebellum, the outputs come from the vermal portion. The vermal portion of the spinocerebellum will project to the nucleus fastigius, and the nucleus fastigius will project to the reticular formation and the vestibular nuclei, and will control the activity of reticulospinal and vestibulospinal tract. The paravermal portion will project to nucleus interpositus and will project to red nucleus and control the activity of rubrospinal tract. Whereas outputs are coming from the cerebrocerebellum, they will project to the nucleus dentatus and in turn will project to the motor cortex via the thalamus and control the activity of corticospinal tract. Cerebellar outputs come from vestibular cerebellum, spinocerebellum, and cerebrocerebellum. Outputs coming from the vestibular cerebellum, they are coming from the paravermal zone. Without any projection in the deep cerebellar nucleus, they directly project to vestibular nucleus and control the activity of vestibulospinal tract. Outputs which are coming from the spinocerebellum, they come from the vermal portion as well as in the paravermal portion. Outputs coming from the vermal portion project to the nucleus fastigius and they will project to the vestibular nuclei and the reticular nuclei, and they will control the activity of reticulospinal tract and vestibulospinal tract. Outputs coming from the paravermal portion project to the nucleus interpositus, which in turn projects to the red nucleus and controls the activity of rubrospinal tract. Outputs from the cerebrocerebellum, the cerebellar hemisphere, the hemispheric zone, it will project to the nucleus dentatus. Nucleus dentatus will project to the thalamus and in turn will project to the motor cortex, and it will control the activity of corticospinal tract. And different parts in the project to the different motor nuclei and also to the motor cortex. So the cerebellum will control the activity of all the descending tracts, that is pyramidal as well as extrapyramidal tracts, that is corticospinal and the corticobulbar tract. Because it is projecting to the cortex, it is controlling all the descending tracts. Neurons in the cerebellar cortex. There are various types of neurons in the cerebellar cortex: Purkinje cell, granule cell, basket cell, Golgi cell, and stellate cells. Now, internal connections of cerebellum. There are three layers in the cerebellar cortex: the outer molecular layer, the middle Purkinje cell layer, and the inner granular cell layer. Internal connections of cerebellum. There are three layers in the cerebellar cortex: the outer molecular, the middle Purkinje cell, and the inner granule cell layer. There are two main inputs to the cerebellum. Two main inputs. One is the climbing fibers and the other is mossy fibers. These climbing fibers directly project to the Purkinje cell. Climbing fibers, they directly project on this Purkinje cell. The mossy fibers, they will project onto the granule cell. But these mossy fibers, they will project to this Purkinje cell via these parallel fibers, which are the axons of these granule cells. These parallel fibers also project to the other neurons of the cerebral cortex, which are the stellate cell and also the basket cell. They will project to the stellate cell, and the stellate cell will in turn project to the Purkinje cell and inhibit the Purkinje cell. They will project to the basket cell, and the basket cell will in turn project to the Purkinje cell and inhibit it, because the neurotransmitter which is released by the stellate cell, the basket cell, all these are inhibitory neurotransmitter, which is GABA, and it will inhibit the Purkinje cell. This type of inhibition is called feed-forward inhibition. These granule cells just stimulated by the mossy fibers, they will also give an excitatory input to the Golgi cell, and the Golgi cell also releasing the neurotransmitter GABA, an inhibitory neurotransmitter, will inhibit this granule cell and it will affect the output of these granule cells. These Purkinje cells, they will project to the deep cerebellar nuclei, and this output is also inhibitory because the neurotransmitter is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and the axons of this Purkinje cell are the only axons which leave the cerebellar cortex. And this deep cerebellar nuclei, despite receiving inhibitory input from this Purkinje cell, Its output by the deep cerebellar nuclei is always excitatory only because it receives an excitatory input from the climbing fibers, from the mossy fibers, and various other inputs also. All these inputs are excitatory, and therefore the output which is given by the deep cerebellar nuclei is also an excitatory one. Thank you, guys.